Fade in. The clinic's examination room is small but clean. A bright overhead light hums softly as Dr. Carter pulls on a pair of gloves. The homeless man sits on the edge of the examination table, his shoulders slumped, his breathing shallow. Dr. Carter, calmly, "What's your name?" Homeless man, hesitant, voice cracking. "Daniel. Daniel Reeves." Dr. Carter nods, making a note. He notices Daniel's cracked lips, sunken eyes, and bruised hands, clear signs of prolonged hardship. He gently checks his pulse, frowning slightly at how weak it is. "Dr. Carter, how long have you been feeling like this, Daniel?" Daniel, soft chuckle, followed by a cough. "Long enough to stop keeping track." Dr. Carter sighs. He's seen cases like this before. Malnutrition, dehydration, possibly something worse lurking beneath the surface. He glances at the receptionist, who stands nearby, uncertain. Dr. Carter, firmly, "We'll run some tests. Get him some water and something light to eat." The receptionist hesitates before nodding, leaving the room. Dr. Carter turns back to Daniel, who watches him with weary yet grateful eyes. Daniel whispers, "Why are you helping me?" "I have nothing to give." Dr. Carter, small smile. "Not everything in life has a price tag, Daniel." As the receptionist returns with a small meal, Daniel hesitates before taking the food. His hands shake as he lifts a spoonful of soup to his lips. He eats slowly, savoring every bite like it's the first real meal he's had in weeks. Dr. Carter watches, his heart aching at the sight. Narrator, Vio. Dr. Carter had spent years in medicine, but no textbook or lecture could prepare him for moments like this, where humanity overshadowed science. He didn't see a homeless man sitting before him. He saw a person, someone who needed help, someone who still mattered. After eating, Daniel leans back, his face slightly less pale. Dr. Carter checks his blood pressure and listens to his heartbeat. There's a concerning murmur, but he doesn't mention it yet. He doesn't want to alarm Daniel before he knows more. "Dr. Carter, I'll need to do a few blood tests to see what's going on. Do you have any medical history I should know about?" Daniel shrugs. "Haven't seen a doctor in over 10 years. Last I remember, they said something about my heart, but I couldn't afford the tests." Dr. Carter's frown deepens. He had suspected as much. He pats Daniel's shoulder reassuringly before stepping out to prepare for the blood work. Meanwhile, in his office, Dr. Carter stares at Daniel's preliminary report. Malnourished, dangerously low hemoglobin levels, signs of a long-ignored heart condition. His mind races. He should refer Daniel to a hospital, but without insurance or money, he knows what will happen. The system will turn him away, just as it has countless others. The thought weighs heavily on him. Narrator, Vio. Dr. Carter had taken an oath to heal, to do no harm. But what happens when the world itself is the one causing harm? When society turns its back on those who need help the most? Taking a deep breath, he makes a decision. He will personally cover the costs for Daniel's tests. It's a risk, given his already tight budget, but something deep inside him tells him it's the right thing to do. Dr. Carter, to himself, determined, "Let's get you the care you deserve, Daniel." Fade out. Fade in. A week passes. Daniel has returned to the clinic for his test results. He looks better. Still thin, still weary, but with a little more color in his cheeks. Dr. Carter sits across from him, reviewing the medical report. Dr. Carter, gently, "Daniel, I won't sugarcoat this. Your condition is serious. You have a heart valve defect, and your blood work shows signs of severe anemia. Left untreated, this could be life-threatening." Daniel nods slowly, his expression unreadable. He isn't surprised. Life has never been kind to him. He takes a deep breath, bracing himself for the worst. Daniel, forcing a small smile, "Well, Doc, I appreciate the honesty. But you and I both know I can't afford the treatment." Dr. Carter leans forward, his expression firm. "Dr. Carter, I've already made some calls. There's a specialist at the city hospital who owes me a favor. He's agreed to see you for free. And as for the medication, I'll take care of it." Daniel's eyes widen. He stares at Dr. Carter as if he's just spoken a foreign language. Daniel, in disbelief. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" Dr. Carter, shrugging, smiling slightly. Because everyone deserves a chance, Daniel. And because I can help, so I will. For the first time in years, Daniel feels something foreign bubbling inside him. Hope. He swallows hard, nodding slowly. Daniel, softly. I don't know what to say. Dr. Carter, smirking slightly. How about I'll show up to my appointment? Daniel chuckles, a genuine, warm laugh that surprises even him. He nods. Daniel, I'll be there. Cut to a few days later. Daniel sits in the city hospital's cardiology department. He's nervous but also determined. The specialist, Dr. Andrews, examines his chart and confirms Dr. Carter's diagnosis. A surgery is recommended, but Daniel will need time to prepare. That night, Daniel lies awake in the small shelter where he's been staying. He stares at the ceiling, processing everything. He never expected kindness, never believed anyone would go out of their way for someone like him. But Dr. Carter did. And for the first time in years, Daniel allows himself to dream. Dream of a future where he isn't just surviving, but living. Back at the clinic, Dr. Carter watches the rain drizzle outside his window. His staff has left for the night, but he remains, deep in thought. He knows the risks of getting too emotionally involved with a patient, but something about Daniel's case feels different. There's something unspoken in the way Daniel carries himself, something unresolved. But what? Narrator, Vio. Sometimes, when you help someone, you don't just change their life, you change your own. Dr. Carter didn't realize it yet, but his act of kindness was setting something in motion, something bigger than he could ever imagine. Fade out, fade in. A week later, Daniel sits in the waiting area of the hospital, his fingers tapping anxiously on his knee. Today is the day he'll undergo the first round of pre-surgical tests. He takes a deep breath, still struggling to believe this is happening. Dr. Carter arrives, carrying a cup of coffee. He sits beside Daniel, handing him the cup. Dr. Carter, smiling, thought you might need this. You look like you didn't sleep much. Daniel takes the cup, his fingers curling around the warmth. He chuckles dryly. Daniel, sighing, can't blame me for being a little nervous. This is a big step for a guy who thought he wouldn't live to see another winter. Dr. Carter nods, serious now. It is a big step. But you're not alone in this, Daniel. Daniel looks at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. He nods, his grip tightening on the cup. Cut to later that day. Daniel undergoes several medical tests, blood work, x-rays, and an echocardiogram. Dr. Andrews goes over the final preparations for surgery. Daniel listens intently, still grappling with the fact that a few weeks ago, he was sleeping under a bridge, convinced his life was over. Now, he has doctors fighting for him, giving him a chance he never thought he deserved. That evening, Daniel walks out of the hospital, his mind racing. He decides to take a detour before heading back to the shelter. He walks the familiar streets of his past, the park bench where he spent cold nights, the soup kitchen that occasionally gave him a warm meal, the alleyway where he once hid from the world. As he walks, memories flood him. The night he lost his job, the day his wife left, unable to bear the weight of their struggles, the moment he gave up on himself. For years, he convinced himself that no one cared, that he was invisible. But now, Dr. Carter's kindness has forced him to rethink everything. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Cut to Dr. Carter's clinic. He sits at his desk, reviewing Daniel's latest test results. His brow furrows. Something isn't right. He picks up the phone and dials the hospital. Dr. Carter, urgent tone. This is Dr. Carter. I need to speak with Dr. Andrews regarding Daniel Warren's latest blood work. Moments later, Dr. Andrews comes on the line. Dr. Andrews, I was just about to call you, Carter. We found something unexpected in Daniel's results. Dr. Carter's grip tightens on the phone. Dr. Carter, go on. Dr. Andrews, hesitant. His DNA markers. They match a missing person case from nearly 20 years ago. The name isn't Daniel Warren. It's Jacob Lawson. Dr. Carter's eyes widen. He leans back in his chair, stunned. Dr. Carter, softly, to himself, Jacob Lawson, why does that name sound familiar? Cut to Daniel, still walking through the city. He stops in front of an old, worn-down house. His hands shake as he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a tattered photograph. It's a picture of a little boy, no older than 5, standing beside a woman with kind eyes. He exhales shakily, brushing his thumb over the image. Flashback: a much younger Daniel, then known as Jacob, playing in the front yard of this very house. His mother calls to him from the porch, laughing. The memory is warm, filled with love. Back to present. Daniel clenches his jaw, forcing the memory away. He tucks the photo back into his pocket and turns to leave. But just as he steps away, a voice calls out from behind him. Woman's voice, shaky, disbelieving. Jacob. Daniel freezes. His breath catches in his throat. Slowly, he turns around. Standing on the porch is an elderly woman. Her eyes are filled with shock, her hands trembling. She takes a step forward, tears welling in her eyes. Woman, whispering, It is you, isn't it? Daniel's world tilts. He can't breathe. He can't move. The past, the one he tried to bury, has finally caught up with him. Fade out, fade in. Daniel stands frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The elderly woman on the porch stares at him with tear-filled eyes, her hands trembling. The street around them feels eerily silent, as if the entire world has stopped to witness this moment. Daniel, voice barely above a whisper. Who are you? The woman lets out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. Her lips tremble as she speaks. Woman, softly. Jacob, it's me. It's your mother. Daniel's breath catches. His entire body stiffens. No, that's impossible. His mother died years ago, or so he believed. His mind races, struggling to process her words. He takes a step back, shaking his head. Daniel, hoarse whisper. No, my mother. She's gone. She died. Tears spill down the woman's cheeks as she shakes her head. Mrs. Lawson, pleading. No, sweetheart. I never stopped looking for you. I thought I lost you forever, but you were taken from me. Daniel's vision blurs as memories start surfacing. Fragmented flashes of a childhood he barely remembers. A warm home, laughter, a loving embrace, and then darkness, fear, a strange man taking him away. The years that followed were a haze of survival, of lost identity, of becoming someone else entirely. He staggers backward, his hands gripping his head. The overwhelming rush of emotions is suffocating. Daniel, struggling to breathe. No, this doesn't make sense. Mrs. Lawson steps forward cautiously, as if afraid he might disappear again. Mrs. Lawson, softly. Jacob, please. Let me explain. Daniel clenches his fists, the turmoil evident on his face. A part of him wants to run, to disappear like he always has. But another part, a small, fragile part, wants to believe her. Cut to later that evening. They sit in Mrs. Lawson's modest living room. The walls are covered with old photographs, memories frozen in time. Mrs. Lawson wipes her tears, her voice breaking as she speaks. Mrs. Lawson, voice shaking. You were only 7 when you went missing. I remember that day like it was yesterday. One moment, you were playing in the front yard. The next, you were gone. She looks at Daniel with pained eyes. Mrs. Lawson, the police searched everywhere. Your father and I never gave up hope, but as the years passed, people told us to move on. But I couldn't. I never stopped looking for you. Daniel swallows hard, gripping his knees. His mind is a storm of confusion, anger, and sorrow. Daniel, quietly. I don't remember much, just pieces. I remember being scared, being alone. Mrs. Lawson, reaching for his hand. You were taken, sweetheart. Someone stole you from us. And somehow, you ended up lost in a world that never gave you a way back. Daniel's jaw tightens. He spent his entire life believing he was unwanted, abandoned. But now, he realizes the truth. He wasn't thrown away. He was stolen. And the life he could have had was ripped from him. Tears spill down his face. His mother, the woman he thought he lost forever, is sitting right in front of him. And for the first time in decades, he doesn't feel completely alone. MRS Lawson, squeezing his hand gently. You're home now, Jacob. And I'm not letting you go again. Cut TO, the next day. Dr. Carter is pacing in his office when Daniel walks in. Dr. Carter looks up, relief washing over his face. Dr. Carter, concerned? Daniel, I've been trying to reach you. There's something important I need to tell you. Daniel gives him a small, bittersweet smile. Daniel, softly, I already know. Dr. Carter's eyebrows furrow in confusion. Dr. Carter, you do? Daniel nods, his expression unreadable. Daniel, quietly, I met her. My mother. Dr. Carter's mouth parts in shock. He steps closer, searching Daniel's face. Dr. Carter, in disbelief. So, it's true. Daniel lets out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair. Daniel, yeah, I guess I was never really Daniel Warren. I was Jacob Lawson all along. A beat of silence passes. Then, Dr. Carter smiles, clapping a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Dr. Carter, gently, no matter what name you had before, you're still the same man who walked into my clinic needing help. And you're still the man I believe in. Daniel looks down, emotion swirling in his eyes. He nods, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel, softly, thank you, document, for everything. Cut TO. A few days later, Daniel is back in the hospital, preparing for surgery. But this time, he isn't alone. Mrs. Lawson sits beside him, holding his hand tightly. Dr. Carter stands on the other side, offering a reassuring smile. As the nurse comes in to take him to the operating room, Daniel exhales deeply. For the first time in years, he isn't afraid, because now he has something to fight for. A future, a family, a second chance at life. Fade out, fade in. Daniel slowly opens his eyes. The bright hospital lights blur his vision for a moment, but then he sees her, his mother. Mrs. Lawson sits by his bedside, clutching his hand, her face lined with worry. Dr. Carter stands near the foot of the bed, his expression a mixture of relief and pride. MRS Lawson, softly, her voice breaking. Oh, sweetheart, you're awake. Daniel blinks, his body feeling heavy, but the pain is dull compared to the emotions surging through him. He tries to speak, but his throat is dry. Mrs. Lawson quickly brings a cup of water to his lips, helping him sip. Daniel, hoarse whisper, did everything go okay? Dr. Carter steps forward, his reassuring smile easing Daniel's nerves. Dr. Carter, nodding, the surgery was a success. Your health is going to improve, Daniel. You made it through. A deep exhale escapes Daniel's lips, relief washing over him. For the first time in years, he isn't bracing for the worst. Instead, he is looking forward to something. His gaze shifts to Mrs. Lawson, whose hands tremble as she holds his. Daniel, softly, you really stayed. Tears pool in Mrs. Lawson's eyes as she nods. MRS Lawson, firmly, I'm never leaving you again, Jacob. Never. Daniel's chest tightens. The name Jacob still feels foreign, yet it holds a warmth he never thought possible. A home he never knew he had. He squeezes his mother's hand, his voice filled with emotion. Daniel, whispers, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be your son. Mrs. Lawson gently strokes his hair, her voice steady. Mrs. Lawson, you don't have to know how. We'll figure it out together. Daniel closes his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in. For the first time in his life, he doesn't feel lost. He feels found. Cut TO. A few weeks later, Daniel, now healthier and stronger, stands outside the clinic, looking up at the sign with Dr. Carter's name on it. The sun is shining, casting a golden glow on the building. He takes a deep breath, feeling the warmth on his skin. Mrs. Lawson stands beside him, her arm gently linked with his. MRS Lawson, smiling softly. You look different. Stronger. Daniel, smirking slightly. I feel different. A comfortable silence stretches between them before Daniel finally speaks again, his tone softer, more thoughtful. Daniel, quietly. For so long, I thought I didn't matter, that I was just another nameless person in the world. But now, I have a name, a family. A reason to keep going. Mrs. Lawson wipes a tear from her cheek, her voice filled with warmth. Mrs. Lawson, you were never nameless, sweetheart. You were always mine. Daniel swallows hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But this time, they aren't the emotions of loneliness or despair. They are emotions of belonging, of hope. Dr. Carter steps out of the clinic, a knowing smile on his face. Dr. Carter, crossing his arms. So, what now? You planning on disappearing again? Or are you going to stick around? Daniel chuckles, shaking his head. Daniel, no more disappearing. He looks at the clinic one last time before turning to his mother. He places a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady, certain. Daniel, I think it's time to go home. Mrs. Lawson lets out a soft, happy sob as she nods. They walk away together, side by side. For the first time in his life, Daniel isn't walking alone. Fade out. A soft instrumental tune plays in the background as the scene fades to black. A voiceover begins, carrying a message of hope and transformation. Voiceover, Daniel's voice. Sometimes, life takes us down roads we never expected. Roads of pain, of struggle, of loneliness. But even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance to turn things around. A kind gesture, a helping hand, a single moment of trust can change everything. I know that now. Images of Daniel's journey flash across the screen. Him collapsing on the street, Dr. Carter helping him, the moment he reunited with his mother, his recovery. Finally, an image of him smiling, standing in the sun, looking ahead with hope. Voiceover, Daniel's voice. We are never truly lost. Sometimes, we just need someone to remind us where we belong.